Good evening. Welcome to PoliticIt podcast. We've got Rob Bishop on tonight, and Rob, you've got a new book. Let's talk about this book for a second.
Okay.
Things I learned in Congress they never taught in school.
So I appreciate that, and the reason I did it, besides being old and needing the money, the reason I did it is because I'd spent 16 years in the legislature, was a speaker, majority leader. I had taught AP government for almost a decade. I thought I was competent when I went back to Washington, and as soon as I got back there, I realized the things that I had been teaching out of the textbook simply missed the mark. And so as I got back there, I felt compelled to start writing down the experiences I had and the history that I had learned about what Congress was really like and the government in Washington. And I wrote down the things I wished I could have had when I was actually teaching the class in high school, and that's what the book is.
Oh, very good.
So part of it is a philosophy of government, then how Congress is structured, and then a few chapters on what it's like to actually live in Washington.
So you've probably got some interesting stories in here. What are some of the memorable ones that you talk about in the book?
Well, I hope they are interesting, at least. So the first effort to try and get on a committee, the important part of a committee is not the prestige you get from it, but how well it impacts the state. So actually, when I ran my first election, I thought I worked really hard, and then I went back there and realized to get on the committees that Jim Hansen, my predecessor, had, which are Resources and Armed Services, would not be a done deal. So I had to campaign as hard to get on the Armed Services Committee as I had to run for Congress in the first place, and do it differently, because now you have a smaller environment of who are going to be the voting members of that. It became important to me.
So why were those committees so important to your race?
If a congressman doesn't go back there just to talk on big issues of the day, if he or she does that, they're pretty much a waste of time. The goal is to go back there and do things that can help the constituency and district, in this case, northern Utah. And obviously with Hill Air Force Base, it is significant to have somebody from Utah on the committee that deals with the armed services. Jim Hansen spent about the same amount of time I did. I still think Jim Hansen basically saved Hill Air Force Base a couple of times because he knew what he was doing and he was a senior member on that committee. Well, the first one, armed services, was a difficult one because lots of people want to be on that committee. But if you have a military facility, and our largest one is Hill Air Force Base, but we also have the test and training range. We had Dugway Proving Ground, which is there. Twilla Army Depot was still in existence at that time. Those things become
Was it Defense Depot Ogden too? That was gone before you got.
That had been privatized by that time.
Right.
But Twilla was still running some programs that were out there. So it was important, and I realized it wasn't just a done thing. I really had to work hard and convince people.
So even though
be there.
Jim Hansen was in a senior position there,
I thought it was going to be. I thought I could just take his seat and there would be a Utah seat. It doesn't quite work that way. And I'm convinced that Jim Hansen had earlier saved Hill Air Force Base in a couple of BRAC rounds, base realignment and closure rounds. And when I went back there, ironically, they were just starting another BRAC round, and I was trying to get on that committee for that same purpose of trying to replicate what Jim Hansen had done. I didn't replicate it nearly as well as he did, but that was the purpose. So having a Utahn on a military committee is extremely important for northern Utah because, Hill Air Force Base is the economic engine of northern Utah. If that were taken away, this would be a ghost state at that stage of the game. And resources.
Well, and you look at Northrop coming in there and stuff now, and all the jobs that followed that.
And that was a struggle to actually get in. There were a lot of people that didn't want that third leg of the triad at all. But it's important. And so what Northrop is doing is vital to the security, and the fact that they're doing it at Hill is vital to Utah and Utah's economy. So all that is part of it. And for resources, when the state is 60% controlled by the federal government, 70 depending on how you want to count it, the federal government tells the state of Utah what it can and cannot do with the resources that are here. It is vital to have somebody there. In fact, let me throw this out too. Everyone's talking about the border today. Uh-huh. Very few people realize from California, from the ocean to Texas, 80% of that border is owned by the federal government. And over half of that is in wilderness designation. And in the Obama administration, they did a memo of understanding between Interior and Homeland Security that gave the Interior managers, the land managers, the right to tell Homeland Security how they would function in securing the border and what they would do to do it. Now, that memo has to go. And I'm afraid I hear a lot of people talking about how they want to solve the border problem. No one is talking about that memo, which ties the hands of the Border Patrol more than anything else. And if you're going to get rid of that, you need a new administration, first of all. But you need somebody on the Resource Committee, because that has jurisdiction over those land issues, and that's where we can put the pressure on it.
Right. And you ended up being chair of that committee, didn't you?
Yes, that's when I decided to terminate myself, when I realized I could no longer be chairman of that committee. And I said, okay, now it's time to let somebody else try and get on the committee and go from there.
Yeah. So now, I mean, what's our best defense there right now is Celeste, right? Is that true? Or
Celeste, because she came in so late, got the leftovers.
Right.
But she also got some promises that they want her on resources, because she understands resource issues as nobody else in this state or the delegation does. And she's got a pretty good in with the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, who is at his last time around as well, to get on a position there as well. And that's what she wants. That would be essential for the state of Utah.
So that would be yeah, that's one that we don't want to give up on.
No, I'm happy that she is there, an underdog, but she's an underdog that's there because she's intelligent and she knows about what she is talking.
Right.
It's not just a bunch of memorized campaign lines that are going out there. She understands the issue, and that's why I'm really proud that she happens to be there.
Yeah. Yeah. So what are some of the other things that come up that you learned? I mean, you were there quite a while.
Well, I talk about, if you go back to Washington and you go into the chamber and listen to the debate, you'll notice that no one's there. There's a reason for that. That's called rolled votes, something no one ever talks about, and none of the books do, and I wish they would. This was not the way Congress originally happened. People used to go into Congress to be entertained and listen to the debate. It doesn't happen in the last 50, 60 years because they've had rolled votes, which means at 4 o'clock we'll do 15 votes, which means no one is going to be on the floor until just before 4 o'clock to do their 15 votes. And they miss all the debate that's led up to the actual votes that take place. That's what roll votes are so bad. Some committees, in my committee, I refused to do that. We voted in real time. As soon as we debated an amendment, we voted on the amendment, and people had to be there or they would miss out totally. But on the floor, that's not the way it works. And in some committees, that's not the way it works. They'll say, be here by 4 o'clock, and you come in and start voting on things you have not heard and do not know.
So not only have you not read the bill, you haven't even listened to the debate on the bill.
And the debate often is fascinating, I thought. But there is nobody on the floor to listen to it because we roll votes. And people are busy, so they do something else until they have to come and vote. If we did things in the old days where you voted in real time and forgot this rolled vote idea, people would have to stay on the floor because they would be afraid of missing a vote. And that's the one thing they don't want to do. That looks really bad back home if you miss the vote.
Yeah.
The legislature,
if it's a key vote for your district too, right?
Well, anything. People don't make a distinction. They say, "Oh, you missed 90% of the votes." That's what they'll remember. The difference is in the legislature, and you know how the legislature works.
Right.
You're expected to be at the committees at the same time. You're expected to be on the floor at the same time. The floor has a kind of a system of the debate where it flows. You actually con through and you talk about what the person before you has actually said. There's a consistent. There are good speeches on the House and Senate floor. It's just there is no continuity to them. It's like two ships passing in the night. They have no contact, but they all make sounds as they're going along. It's one of the things I learned, which I think is terrible and needs to be changed. And I hope that someday, I was pushing for that. Someday that procedural change has to take place. It really needs to be there. Same thing. They're talking a lot about omnibus bills. Uh-huh. And how bad they are. The House and the Senate vote on 17 different budget bills. Now, in the Utah legislature, you have an education budget and then the budget.
Right.
If you want to prioritize in the budget, you can do it because the entire budget is there outside of education, is out there in front of you at that time. Washington, if you think too much is spent on military and more should be spent on parks, you want to prioritize that, you can't do it because there is a parks budget bill before you and there's a separate military, and you can prioritize within it, but not between those. There is no general overview of budgets, and that's because the way Congress has structured itself in its appropriations subcommittees, which have a very narrow view, and their staff has a very narrow view of only that area. So that's the other thing I would like to do. I would like to say, no, let's have a lot more omnibus bills where the entire budget is actually in front of you, and then you can have a robust debate on whether your prioritization is where it should be or where it shouldn't be. They can't prioritize because we have the various tranches of budgets in Washington. Utah would die if we tried that.
Right.
We need to do that in Washington. So there are a lot of things that I say are reforms I think have to take place. A lot are simply the stories of what it took like, what it was like trying to get Dr. Pepper in the airports. I knew every Dr. Pepper business where it was dispensed in every airport along the way. And sometimes there was one time where they weren't, there was no one selling Dr. Pepper, but there was one cafe inside the airport that did. So I would go there and I would order a cup of Dr. Pepper without ice. And I would bring an empty bottle with me and then go into the bathroom and pour my cup into my bottle. And of course, everyone was looking at me like I was crazy, and I didn't care because at least at the end, I had my bottle of Dr. Pepper to take on the flight. So even those things I put in there.
Right. That's interesting. We're going to take a break. We'll come right back. Hey Siri, how do I get to the state capitol?
John, the fastest way to get to the Capitol is to make a lot of empty promises, to get help from special interest groups and endorsements from politicians. You will also need to buy a better suit.
That's not going to work for me, Siri. You need to find another way.
John, listen to me. If you're going to win your race, you will need to play the political game. You also need to use more hairspray and buy a golden retriever. Also, a new phone case would be nice.
It's enough of this.
John, are you there? Did you just leave me on the road? Fine. Keep your principles, John.
My name's John Johnson. I'm not running to be part of a system, and I don't owe anyone special favors. I'm running to listen to and work for you. I'm running to get results. Welcome back to PoliticIt. We've got Rob Bishop with us today. We're talking about his new book, The Things I Learned in Congress That They Never Taught in School. I noticed, Rob, the first part of this book, you talk about your philosophy. Let's visit that just a little bit. There's a couple of presidents you talk about. Let's just discuss that a little bit.
This is one of the things that I emphasized when I was teaching, but I wish I'd emphasized it more because it makes a difference. To me, the greatest patriot, the greatest founding father was Isaac Newton, even though he died 60 years before anyone was even talking about a revolution. Because he believed in his third law of physics, but for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. The founders who wrote the Constitution realized you can write any law you want to make people act nice and it won't happen. Madison called those parchment barriers. So the founders were Newtonians, and they believed what you have to do is structure government so there will be balance. One power center will balance against another power center. And the only way you can protect people's individual rights is by that structural balance. And we have two horizontally that we call the checks and balances between the three branches of government.
Right.
And the one that's equally important is the vertical one between the national government and state governments, which we call federalism. There are a couple of presidents who I think moved us in the wrong direction. And as much as Teddy Roosevelt is a nice guy and his picture's on Mount Rushmore, I'm sorry, he did not believe in federalism. He clearly said that states should be administrative units, but big issues should be decided in Washington. And while he was president, he initiated over 1,000 executive orders along that line. Now, we've always had executive orders. Washington did the first executive order, but he did 8 in 8 years. The half century up and before Teddy Roosevelt, they did 158 in 50 years. He did 1,000 in his 7+ years as president. Then when it came, 2 presidents later was Woodrow Wilson. He didn't believe in the separation of powers between the 3 branches of government. He called it he called it constitutional witchcraft. He said, we're dividing powers away. And he didn't think that the legislative body, a bunch of riffraff, should be making decisions. He thought it should be made by the experts in Washington that would be found in the agencies of the executive branch. He did 1,800 executive orders in his 8 years that were there. That's one thing that scares me. Since that time, it's ebbed and flowed. Franklin Roosevelt did over 4,000 executive orders. Eisenhower didn't do many. John F. Kennedy didn't do many. The last couple of presidents have done a lot. So George W. Bush, for every bill he signed, he did a signing statement of how he would enforce it. The last 2 years of the Obama administration, that's when he said, I'm going to rule with a pencil and a telephone.
Right.
Executive orders came out the yin-yang. Even Bush did Trump did executive orders, a lot of them to repeal Obama's, but several of them that he did, which I actually thought were good ideas, but not good ideas simply done by a president making a statement that this is the way we're going to do it in the future. Biden did over 100 in his first month. And in fact, when the Republican Congress slipped from Democrat to Republican in the last election, the head of the Progressive Caucus in Washington said, well, we won't get as many ideas through as we did with Pelosi as Speaker, but that's okay. We'll just get Biden to make more executive orders. So that's the concept we have to realize.
So why is that so damaging? When you go back to this idea of the Newtonian laws, right? Why is that damaging?
Because it makes one person a president, having a fulcrum of power. He can do an executive order, and there is no way of balancing it off. Or even worse, you can have the agencies under him. We call those the deep state. But yeah, they make rules and regulations of how you will live your life, and there's no way of balancing it out until we can change the way we function in Washington and allow Congress to go in there and have to approve every one of those agency changes. Or Congress go in there and fill in the blanks so that a president doesn't have a gaping hole in the law in which he can try and run through an executive order. You'll have power centered only in one group, and there's no way of saying, no, wait, stop, let's think this out. And the people that are put in danger are you and I, people who will have our individual rights threatened because the experts in the agency or the experts in Washington, as opposed to the state, they will be making decisions for us. And that's not the way it should be. That's the way we are trending. That is the danger to our democracy, at least as I see it.
Well, and you know, the issue of federalism, the other balance that people forget a lot of times, that's crucial for us, especially like for instance with our federal lands, right?
If we do not have some kind of say on how the lands are managed, whether it's open or not, if we don't have a say on it, that means somebody else who lives 4 hours flight away in Washington, D.C., who are going to be subject to all sorts of special interest groups lobbying efforts, they'll be making decisions for us. That's wrong. It was never intended to be that way. This massive control of lands by the national government was never intended to be that way. You can't find a reference to it in the Constitution. It only developed out of fiat later on, and it's wrong. We need to start pushing that back. I found it interesting that some of the eastern governors were upset when the federal government started trying to make up rules and regulations on how their coastal waters would be maintained. And they complained about that viciously. But they never said anything about western governors who were saying, we have the same issue with how our federal lands are maintained. They didn't think that was important. It was important when it hit them. So because this impacts the West so much more than the East, and the electoral votes are in the East, not in the West, that's where we need to be very diligent about it. And right. I hope it's understandable, and people need to realize how significant it is.
You know, this year in the legislature, we actually passed a law, which is more of a framework that basically said, we're a sovereign state. If we see an executive order, or if we see an agency that's pushing an order, and the legislative attorneys believe that that's unconstitutional, that actually violates our sovereignty, that we'll call ourselves into session and decide, right? And then we'll tell our state agencies, you can't enforce that law. What do you think about that?
It is a great first step only, but it's a great thing to do. I think you've been in ALEC or not, but they had a proposal one time, and they called it a repeal amendment, which I like, because actually, if you have a balance between the national governments, I'm giving you too much here information. But remember, this is an entire semester class.
Right, yeah.
James Wilson said, because the Constitution asks us to be beholden to two masters, a national and state government. And he said that the two, if they work like the planet system and stay within their bounds, their spheres of influence, will work in harmony. But if one starts to act like a comet and go slashing through the boundaries, it'll bring chaos in its wake. That's what we're happening right now. The balance between the states and the national government are in a balance of chaos because, one, right now, it's the national government is trying to impose on their... Civil war was the exact opposite. States were trying to impose on the national government. We ended in civil war. Let's hope that doesn't happen with the reverse. So Alex says, look, give states some kind of power to do it. And this is a constitutional amendment that I picked up and actually ran in Congress my last couple of terms. Didn't pass it, unfortunately. But it says if the state legislature in 2/3 of the states pass a resolution objecting to a law or an agency rule or regulation, it becomes null and void. States can't tell the federal government what to do, but it simply says, Washington, you go back and you redo that law, you relook at that rule, that agency, because if 2/3 of the states are saying there's a problem, you can probably guess there is a problem. And that, to me, gives the states a power to push back, not to control Washington, that's wrong, but to push back and say, rethink this. Washington could redo it again if they wanted to. But I don't think if 2/3 of the states are going to actually do that, it would actually. And think of it, if you even have 2/3 of the smallest states pushing back, that's not 50% of the population, but that would mean you would have to have Utah and Iowa and Vermont and Hawaii and the Dakotas all agree to something. If you can get that kind of disparity of states to agree to something, there is a problem. We talk about that as one of the things that we were pushing and working for when I was in Congress as well.
So do you think there'll be pushback then against this Utah law? You said that was a good first step, but what?
Of course.
Where do you think it's going to
There will be people that will be claiming that this is states' rights, which is a bad. States don't have rights. States have powers. People have rights. And you can have individual rights the founders were trying to protect, or group rights, which are called civil rights, that come from the government to groups. What the founders were trying to protect are individual rights which come from God that need to be protected from the government. States have powers, and there are a lot of people that are thinking states should not have this kind of power. I think they should. Not to tell Washington what to do, but saying, all right, there's a problem, rethink it, think it again. And that is the role that states have played in the past, and they should play in the future.
So we're about out of time, but any last words on this? Other than you got to read this book.
Yeah, I'm old. I need the money, but no, you can get it on Amazon. There's also a publishing company called Preservation Books in Utah that has it as well. If you go onto their website, you can get it as well, or just go on the Amazon or go to the website with the name of it. And what I hope is it gives people some ideas of what I think government should be, what really happens in Washington, why there are rolled votes, why people are not on the floor, how you get committee assignments.
That idea of rolled votes, like that expression I've heard, that's basically when you're trading votes with people.
Oh. No, there's a different one. It's called log rolling.
Log rolling.
I'll vote for you if you vote for me.
Okay, the rolled votes is what we talked about before.
When I went back there, someone suggested I make a deal with the leadership, and fortunately I didn't do it because I quickly found out that you may make that deal once, and after that, no one will trust you again. If you say I am politically opposed to this, philosophically, which I was trying to say, opposed to this. But if you throw in a bridge or a road for my district, maybe I can vote for it after all. You can do that once, and after that, you're not going to get away with that again. So I did have, if you got just a second.
Yeah.
I did have the House leader, Kevin McCarthy, came up to me and said, Rob, there's a congressman here that wants to recognize a tribe in his state. Now, they'd been trying for a couple of decades to do that, and the other tribes that were already recognized didn't want another recognized tribe in Virginia. And he said, but he came to me and said, I will give you the vote on this important bill if you get my tribe bill actually passed. And so he came to me and said, Rob, that's in your jurisdiction. Do you have a problem with that tribe bill? And I said, no, I was going to do it anyway. But don't sell out cheap to him. Go back and say, all right, I'll guarantee you get your tribe bill passed if you give me 4 other votes that are important to me. Make him pay for that kind of audacity. That happens occasionally. The textbook makes it sound like it happens all the time. It doesn't happen. Very few people actually will sell their votes to somebody else, especially if they don't think it's the right thing in the first place. Because the allegiance of a congressman is actually to their constituents first, not to a friend you have on the floor of the House, or not to somebody over in the Senate. So the textbooks, they got the nuance wrong. It's just not the way it happens. And people do not respect somebody who's actually willing to trade something for a vote or a bill.
Right. Well, I know, Rob, you were very well respected back there, and we're sorry that you're no longer there representing us. But
Well, I fooled them for a while.
Thank you. Thanks for coming in. And the book, again, is The Things I Learned in Congress They Never Taught in School. Representative Rob Bishop, thank you.
No, thank you.
Nice to have you.
I appreciate being able to talk about it because, like I say, it took me basically 18 years to write it. And this is the stuff I wish I had before I went back there in the first place.
Very good. Thank you. We'll see you guys next week.